Okay, now let's take a look at how we can persist these changes on our API. And we'll head back to VS Code and we're going to go back to our API to configure this, of course. So let's go back to Solution Explorer inside the API. And the first thing we'll do is create a new file inside the DTOs folder, which will be a class, and we'll call it member updates DTO. And press return. And inside this class, we'll just add the properties that we're expecting from our client. So we're going to have the string of introduction. We'll have a string for the looking for. We'll have a string for the interests, a string for the city, and a string for the country. That's all we're going to let the user update about their profile. Obviously, we could take more information. We could extend the form. We could do more, of course. But for proving the concept of what we need to do to update a resource, this will be sufficient. And now we have this. We're going to take a look at using AutoMapper to map the other way. We want to map these properties from our member update DTO into an app user object. So let's go to our AutoMapper profiles and we're going to add another mapping and we're going to say create map and we're going to go from our member update DTO and we're going to go to our app user. And let's head over to our user controller, as this is where we're going to provide the update endpoint so that we can call this from our client application. So an update is an HTTP put. So we'll create an HTTP put endpoint and we'll say public async task and we're going to return an action result from this. So it's going to be a task of type action result. And typically we don't return anything from an HTTP put method. And that's based on the understanding that when a client is calling this endpoint to update something, they already have the knowledge about what they are updating and what has been updated. So there's little benefit, and in fact there's zero benefit to sending back the updated resource. The ID is not going to change, and the only thing that is going to change is what the client is telling our API server about. So we'll not return anything from this apart from the action result, so whether or not we succeeded. And we're going to call the method update user and we're going to have the member update DTO as a parameter and we'll call it member update DTO. Now the first thing we need to do here is get hold of our username from the HTTP context. Now when we looked at debugging earlier, we saw that there was a user object available inside our API controller. And we can use that to get hold of the username because every time a user authenticates, which they are going to be doing to this controller because we have the authorize attribute here, then they're going to be sending up the bearer token. Inside that bearer token is the claims about that user, and we can access that information inside our controller endpoints. So I'm going to save our username and we can say equals user, and there's a whole bunch of different ways of finding the claims inside a user. Let's take a look at one way and we can use find first and we can say claim types and we can specify name identifier. That's just one of several different ways, and what we'll do eventually is we'll create a method to help us do that, but we should be able to get our claim from this method. And we specified our username as the name identifier. If we go back and take a look at the token service, then this is what we used for our username inside here. So we should be able to get it from there. But let's stick a breakpoint on here anyway, and we'll run it through the debugger so that we can see what's going on. So we're all happy about what the information we get from the user object, and we'll take a look at what's inside there. So we're going to need to check this for null because the find first is going to return the first matching claim or null if no match is found. So we need to check this because it could be null. So we'll check to see if the username is equal to null. And if it is, we're going to return a bad request and we'll just say no username found in token. And that's really just for us. It's not something I would typically put in a normal application, but this will give us a hint about where the request went wrong in normal usage. And then we're going to get our user from the repository. So we're going to say var user equals await, and we're going to say user repository, and we're going to say get user by username async, and pass in the username. And we've got a complaint, and it says cannot convert from system security claims claim to string. Okay, so what we should get from this is a claim, and we want this to be a string. So after the name identifier, we'll just specify value, and we'll add the optional chaining because sure, we know this could be null, and we're going to check for null here. So by the time we get to here, this should be valid. And we'll then check to see if the user is null, because again, from our repository, this could also return null. And we'll return a bad request, and we'll say could not find user. And then we're going to bring AutoMapper into play. So we're going to need to inject this because we did remove it earlier. And I'm going to say imapper and mapper. And then inside our code, let's use that. And we're going to say mapper.map. And on this occasion, we just provide parentheses as we've got two objects. One object we want to map to the other one. And the object we want to map from is the member update DTO. And we want to map this in to our user object. So what's happening here from Entity Framework's point of view is we've got a user from our database via Entity Framework. Entity Framework is tracking this user. When we update that user object with the mapper.map, Entity Framework is updating this user object. So when we call the save changes method next, then this will save the changes into the database. So we're going to do that, and we're going to say if, and we're going to say await user repository and save all async. And if that is successful, we're going to return a 200 type response, but the correct response from an HTTP puts method is no content. So we're effectively saying, yep, that was okay, but we're not going to return anything to you. So don't expect to see any properties inside here, but this is an okay response. We updated your resource on the database, and we're effectively returning what is a 204 no content response. And if the save to the database was unsuccessful, then we're going to return a bad request, and we're going to say failed to update the user. And okay, so let's go test this functionality, and let's check the terminal to see what's going on with our API. And it says hot reload of changes succeeded. Do I believe it? No, I do not believe it. I'm just going to stop and restart the API server, as I want this to work the first time, especially if I'm making the effort to start the debugger as well. I want to give this the best chance of success. Okay, and now the application has restarted. Let's fire up the debugger so that we hit this breakpoint to see what's going on. So I've got the application running, so I can use the .NET Core attached, and I'll hit the play button. And I'm going to search for API and select this one and get the debugger underway. So now that has started, let's go to Postman. And inside section 10, I'm first of all going to log in as Lisa and save the token into the environment. And that has worked. And then I'm going to use the next request, the put request, to update the user. And inside the body of this request, we're effectively updating everything to say updated whatever, and we should be sending the authorization token as well. So what this should mean is that we hit the breakpoints, because if we're not authenticated, we will not hit the breakpoint, because .NET will not let us get that far if we don't meet the authorization requirement. So we should be good to test this and hit the breakpoint. So I'm going to send the request, and sure enough we have. So our first task is to get hold of this username. And we're looking for the claim types with the name identifier. So if we take a look at the lists inside our debugger, and we take a look at the user object, this is what we're using, and then we take a look at the claims and the results view, then we can see inside here we have a claim for the name identifier. Bit of a long value there because of the URL, the schemas, XML SOAP, etc. But what we can see is that this is set to Lisa, and that's the user I'm logging in as. So what we would expect to see when we move past this, and I go on to the next line, is that we have the username set to Lisa, and we do. So we're not going to return a bad request here. We'll step over this, and then we're going to go and get our user from the repository. So we'll step over this one, and now our user object is populated. And we can see all of the details inside here. Now at this point, Entity Framework is tracking this user. And if we step over this one, then we'll get to our mapping functionality. And we're going to take our member update DTO, which contains these properties, and they're going to be mapped into our user object. So before we do this, if we expand the user, then currently we've got city, country set to these values and all of our interests, the lorem ipsum stuff. But once we step over this line of code, then what should happen is our user gets updated with the properties from the member DTO. So if we expand the user again, then we can see all of the updates to our app user object. That means there are some changes that can be saved into the database. So what we should see is we move on to the return statement of return no content after we execute this, and that is what's going to happen. We can see the little kind of arrow thing there, which means we're returning the content, and if we step over again, we're going to complete our request and step over, and that's the request finished. And now I've kind of gone into middleware, so I'm just going to continue, and what we should see back in Postman is we've got the 204 no content. Perfect. And if I go back to an earlier request and I go and get user by username and I get Lisa's profile, I'm going to see the updated values in this object. And sure enough, I can see updated, 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 etc. Now what's going to happen if we send something up to our server that doesn't result in the database being updated? Because if I send up exactly the same information, what's going to happen then? Well, let's take a look. We've got our debugger still running, so I'm going to send this request. We go back to the debugger. We can step over all of these lines of code. And when we get to the mapping section, we're going to map the same properties that are already stated as lists into our user object. So we'll do that. We're not going to fail at that point, but then we get to our repository method. How many changes are going to be saved into our database? Well, there's going to be 0 changes because it's exactly the same. And if I step over this again, we go to the bad request and we fail to update the user. But that's fine because nothing has changed. Now, I'm going to say that's okay. And we've sent up the same information, but we're getting a 400 bad request because nothing has changed. Now we're going to prevent the user from doing that inside our user interface, but supposing you did want that behavior, where even if nothing is saved, but you've accepted the update into your API controller, what you could do at this point is say user repository and say update and pass in the user. If you do this, then we're explicitly telling Entity Framework the user has been modified, and then in theory at least, when you do save those changes, then it would accept that as a save to our database, a change, and you should get the no content returned. I'm not going to do that because it feels a bit pointless, because we're not going to let the user send up unchanged information anyway. And quite frankly, I think it should be a bad request if they're trying to save something that hasn't changed. So now we've got this persisted in our database. I'm just going to disconnect the debugger and clean up the breakpoint. Our next step is going to be to update this in our client app as well, and we'll look at that next.